Welcome to the Daugherty Water for Food podcast. Since 2010, the Daugherty Water for Food Global Institute at the University of Nebraska has worked toward one goal, a food and water secure world. One in which global food security is ensured without compromising the use of water to meet other essential human and environmental needs. It's a daunting vision, but one that is vitally important. This podcast amplifies the voices of those making waves in this space. We hope you enjoy today's episode.
Welcome to the Water for Food podcast. My name is Ariana Elmas. I'm the communications specialist for the Daugherty Water for Food Global Institute at the University of Nebraska, which is proud to lead USAID's Feed the Future Innovation Lab for Irrigation and Mechanization Systems, or ILIMS. The purpose of this new lab's research is to expand the use of irrigation and mechanization technologies and practices in an inclusive, economically, and environmentally sustainable way. Today, I'm happy to introduce ILIMS' new Deputy Director, Jude Cobbing, and we'll be talking with him about what drew him to ILIMS and the opportunities he sees within the project. Jude, thank you so much for joining me today, and we'll just go ahead and dive right into it. So Jude, can you just start by introducing yourself, talk a bit about your background and how it relates to ILIMS?
Sure, thank you, Ariana, and it's great to be here, and hello to all the listeners. My name's Jude Cobbing. I'm the new Deputy Director, and I'm really excited to be at ILIMS. My background, as you can probably hear, I didn't grow up in the United States. I was born in Zimbabwe and grew up mainly in South Africa. I studied geology in my undergraduate in Cape Town, and when I finished that, I decided I didn't want to go into mining, which most people were doing at the time in South Africa, and I ended up working for a small non-profit in a very rural part of South Africa, working on water supply and agricultural systems, including irrigation, small pumps and so on. And it was a really exciting time to be doing that in South Africa. It was right after the first democratic elections. Nelson Mandela was the new president, and I learned a huge amount in that first year. It really sparked an interest in groundwater resources. It was a part of the country where there was a lot of reliance on wells and boreholes, and I ended up later going to study groundwater, and I did that in London. I did a master's in hydrogeology and then worked in England for 5 years for the British Geological Survey on a whole range of technical issues to do with groundwater, both in Britain but also in Africa. We had the BGS still had some programs that were working on groundwater in countries like Nigeria and Malawi and Ghana. And I was lucky enough to go and work in some of those countries and work on things like water quality and where to drill for groundwater and various other issues, but mostly sort of, I guess you could call them technical hydrogeology issues. I after working in the UK, then I was back in South Africa for nearly 10 years, working first in the research sector and later in the private sector on a whole range of things, on water supply in South Africa, working alongside the Department of Water Affairs on basic water supplies, water quality, the national groundwater strategy in South Africa, but also working on mine water. There was a lot of, and still is a lot of pollution-related issues in South Africa to do with the mining legacy, and so I got involved quite heavily in that and got very interested in groundwater quality and remediation of groundwater. And as time went on, I got more and more interested in the kind of sort of, let's call them the social and institutional side of groundwater work. And obviously the sort of technical groundwater conditions were important, but it was often the social and institutional factors that were the determining conditions for success in any particular project. And I started doing my PhD in South Africa part-time, looking at an aquifer in the northern part of the country where there's a very heavy irrigation industry, but the water is also used for domestic supply and for industry as well. So there's a lot of stakeholders there who all utilize that groundwater. And the aquifer I was interested in was very heavily studied. We knew a lot about it hydrogeologically, and yet we were still seeing big problems with overdraft and contestation over water rights and so on. And my PhD was all about how what's really going on there. Why is it that we, even though we know a huge amount about this technically, we've got this set of very good laws, very progressive laws and policy, and yet we still seem to be failing in management of it. And I was fascinated by that and did that as my PhD thesis under a very interesting supervisor who was a transdisciplinarian. He was a geologist originally, but had become convinced that we needed to look much further than just the so-called hard sciences to look for solutions and sustainability. I moved to the US in 2015, and at that stage I was finishing off my PhD, but I started consulting to the World Bank in Washington, D.C. on African groundwater resources, and was lucky enough to coincide with a project they were doing on quantifying groundwater in Africa, both for domestic use, but also for small-scale irrigation, and worked with some really interesting people on a couple of reports looking at African groundwater resource sustainability, and particularly under climate change. Then most recently, I worked for Save the Children in Washington, D.C. as well as a water sanitation and hygiene specialist focusing on Africa, until starting at ILIMS 5-6 weeks ago.
And we're so happy to have you here. So can you tell us about the ILIMS project and what makes it unique and what drew you to it?
Yes, of course. So ILIMS is a project that takes a systems approach to the problems, let's call them, of mechanization and irrigation in the global south, mostly in Africa, but in Central America and South Asia as well. And by which I mean we look at the whole range of factors that basically determine the success or failure of small farmers implementing irrigation and mechanization systems. And that's something that's often a lot of lip service is paid to, but it's often not observed in reality. And I think the unique attribute of ILIMS is that we really do want to look at all of those different factors and focus on what are the bottlenecks or what are the weak links in the chain that prevent small farmers from accessing irrigation and mechanization technology and related services and increasing sustainability, increasing on-farm yields, increasing economic growth at the farmer scale. And we intend to manage a portfolio of research that will give us insights into that whole value chain. And I think that might sound a bit high level, but it really is important at a time when I think a lot of people are highly specialized and are just have one, they're just feeling one part of the elephant in the dark room. That one, nobody has a kind of big picture, and we at ILIMS are hoping to retain that big picture capacity. So that really interested me about ILIMS. The other thing, obviously, is that ILIMS were right bang in the middle of Nebraska, where irrigation is almost the state business. There's not much that Nebraskans don't know about irrigation and how to manage successful and sustainable irrigation value chains. Let's just put it that way. And I think there's a tremendous amount that ILIMS can take from the context in Nebraska and transfer or make that technology available or make some of that knowledge available in partnership with small farmers particularly in Africa. So that's the other thing. It's certainly no coincidence that ILIMS is at the University of Nebraska in Lincoln, and that it really is ground zero for irrigation, particularly irrigation on groundwater, as you know.
So irrigation, I think a lot of times is viewed as extractive. Can you talk about why we need irrigation in sub-Saharan Africa? Why irrigation?
Yes, of course. Irrigation sometimes gets a bit of a bad rap in that we tend to sometimes focus on the drawbacks and disbenefits, but we really need to remember that in many parts of the world, the kinds of agriculture that we have would just not be possible without irrigation. Sub-Saharan Africa has, as a global region, has the highest rainfall volatility of anywhere in the world. So it's very difficult for farmers of any size to plan using only rainfall, particularly in what are called the African drylands, which are the areas of Africa where rainfall is not only low but also sporadic, and the risk is very high. So irrigation is really a way of reducing risk and ensuring that the investments that are put into the land can be realized. It's something that can be sustainably managed and certainly is in many parts of the world. And to come back to Nebraska, the natural resource districts are a really good example of how stakeholders working together can ensure that irrigation water is managed sustainably, simply because it's too valuable to let it run out or to let it disappear or diminish. And so I think there's no doubt that huge parts of Africa would really benefit from irrigation. In fact, the kind of modern productive agriculture that are needed to feed the people both today and in the future are really not going to be possible in many places without at least some kind of irrigation. So, irrigation is kind of a given. It's absolutely vital in sub-Saharan Africa. And just another figure to quote you there, that in water-scarce areas of sub-Saharan Africa, fewer than 5% of small-scale farmers have access to irrigation technology, and the comparable figure for South Asia is 60%. So we're way behind the curve in sub-Saharan Africa, and irrigation, it's not the only factor in successful small-scale farming, but it's certainly a cornerstone.
Looking at India, for example, India was previously underdeveloped, but the South Asia region is now one of the most largely irrigated areas of the world. However, India is now in a situation where its groundwater is being overpumped. So if we look at the two regions side by side, how can we expand irrigation in Africa while making sure that we're maintaining its groundwater?
Really good question, Ariana, and it's something that people raise a lot, and I think that it's an important question to answer. The first thing to say is that you're absolutely right. Estimates say that about a third of aquifer blocks in India are overexploited, and there is no doubt that there are parts of India where groundwater overdraft is a serious problem. It's something that there's a lot of very interesting initiatives that are being done to remedy that, from small-scale recharge led by farmers through to changing crops, through to even farming electricity. Instead of having a crop in the field, you might have solar panels, for example. So there are some really interesting solutions emerging from there. But that's not for a moment to underplay the seriousness of the problem. People often say, well, why? That's probably going to happen in Africa if we also advocate for the kind of large-scale irrigation that India has. And I think the first thing to note is that whilst India is one of the world's largest countries, I can't remember how far, it's something like the 5th largest country in the world, the continent of Africa is nearly 10 times the size of India. So to compare the two side by side is sometimes it can be a little misleading, because the sheer size of Africa should be noted. I mean, the drylands regions of Africa alone are approximately the size of the whole of Europe and the whole of India combined. And the other thing to note is that the amount that is of groundwater that is withdrawn in India is vastly more than in sub-Saharan Africa. So the estimate is that India withdraws about 60 times more water than sub-Saharan Africa per unit area. And some more figures there that renewable groundwater resources in sub-Saharan Africa, according to available data, very roughly 1,400 cubic kilometers per annum. And it's estimated that about 20 cubic kilometers per annum are withdrawn currently. So that's about 0.2% of sub-Saharan Africa's renewable groundwater resources. The comparable figure for India is about 58% of India's renewable groundwater resources are utilized. Another figure there is that per capita, sub-Saharan Africa has an annual groundwater abstraction of about 28 cubic meters per annum. And the equivalent figure for India is 208 cubic meters per annum. So you can see that the amounts are radically different at the moment. And, you know, we would be thrilled and delighted with a doubling or a tripling of groundwater withdrawal for irrigation in sub-Saharan Africa on average. And we can see that even if we manage to do that, and it would be an enormous achievement, we're still nowhere near the irrigation intensity of India, partly because Africa is just so much bigger than India and per capita use currently is so much lower. So long story short, we've got a long way to go in sub-Saharan Africa on average before we reach the kinds of over-abstraction crises that we see in parts of India. And the last thing to note is that let's not forget that in achieving that level of irrigation coverage, India has made itself food secure and is able to export food as well, some of it to Africa. And so whilst the problems of overdraft in India should not be minimized, they should be taken in the context of the tremendous gains in agricultural productivity that have been realized. And also, as I said at the beginning, you know, they have sparked some very interesting and very innovative ways in which that overdraft is being remedied. And once it becomes apparent, people start to take it very seriously and start to remedy it. That doesn't mean it's a nice thing to happen. If we can stop it happening, that's a good idea. But we've got a long, long way to go in Africa before we have, on average, those kinds of problems that we see currently in India.
Technology is advancing more rapidly than ever. How is ILIMS finding creative ways to either make the latest technology accessible and equitable in the global south and or leveraging technology to more rapidly achieve its goals?
Well, great question. And I think there's at least two things there that we need to note. And the first is that, as you say, there are huge advances being made all the time, and in things like remote sensing, artificial intelligence, and we need to remain abreast of that and aware of what is being done, and always on the lookout for how this might be leverageable, let's say, for small farmers in parts of Africa or Asia or Central America. That's the first thing. The second thing is that, as I mentioned before, all of this technology is not necessarily useful unless it can be in a form and in a format that is accessible to small farmers themselves or to agricultural extension services in some of the countries that we're working with, in some of the Feed the Future countries. So there's a kind of obligation, responsibility, I think, on us to remain au fait with what is being done, but also keep in the back of our minds that it's no good unless it can be applied, and unless there are measurable things that can be done at the farm level to assist in productivity gains, essentially. So we're going to try and keep our eye on both of those things as we go forward.
Great. I love that technology is only as good as it can be used at the farm level.
Absolutely, absolutely.
So what are some of the ideas or research at DWFI and the University of Nebraska that you look forward to leveraging in your work or collaborating on?
That's a great question. So one of the most exciting things about the University of Nebraska is just the breadth of expertise in groundwater, in irrigation, in farming technology, in mechanization that exists. And so my first order of business really is going to be to just learn as much as I can about who is doing what. I've already had some great meetings with people doing really innovative and interesting things on essentially boosting productivity for small farmers. And as I was saying before, transferring technology from the state of Nebraska and surrounds and making it appropriate for small farmers elsewhere in the world. One of the things that interests me the most is the kinds of data applications that are now being brought to the fore. Things like the drought work that's being done at the University of Nebraska on understanding and predicting drought, the drought vulnerability of any particular farming region. And that work now covers sub-Saharan Africa. And essentially what's being done there is to say, by using all available data and by using the kind of spatial data analysis and computing power that we now have, we can start to look much more accurately at what the risk is for small farmers, even in really remote parts of Africa, taking all of the different factors into account. And really what irrigation mechanization can do is reduce risk. As I said before, irrigation helps us take away the risk of rainfall volatility. Well, the kinds of data applications can do the same thing by providing information to small farmers, the best possible information. We can really help to reduce risk, and reducing risk is one side of the coin. The other side of the coin is then an ability to invest more in better crop varietals and realize greater yields and boost on-farm income, essentially. So, reducing risk and increasing on-farm income really are two sides of the same coin. So I'm really excited about that. And the last thing I'll say about that is that there's often remains to be a gap between the available data and available information and the actual accessibility of that data and information at the farm level, let's say in rural Ghana or rural Nigeria. And I'm really interested in initiatives that make the most up-to-date information, contemporary information, available to farmers in a way that they find useful. And there's been some really interesting work done on that too, which I'm looking forward to learning more about, but also joining with. And I think that, at ILIMS, we're in a good position to look at that. So the whole kind of chain of risk reduction, let's call it.
And what do you look forward to researching or implementing or exploring through this project?
Wow. There's a lot that I could say about that, but I think what I'm going to find, what I'm looking forward to the most is that we are working with some of the most specialized and most expert organizations in the world that look at smallholder farmer sustainable agricultural intensification, let's just call it that, including irrigation and mechanization. And these are folks who've been working on this problem for many years, who understand all of its different dimensions. And the thing I think I'm looking forward to the most at ILIMS is that we're able to coordinate some of those experts and look at a whole range of factors together. And we're hoping and we intend to come up with solutions that are measurable and implementable. I mean, but the kind of, I guess, one of the yardsticks at the end of a project like this is that, have we made a difference to on-farm incomes through small-scale irrigation and mechanization? And can we measure that? How do we quantify that? How do we put numbers to that? And I think that to me is the kind of critical goal that we're going for, but it's also the thing that interests and excites me most. So essentially, we're working with some of the top experts, and I feel very privileged to be in the same room with some of them, both folks that we are contracted with, but also less formal links that we have with people at the University of Nebraska, with some of the other innovation labs, and with other centers of expertise worldwide. So we really see ourselves as a kind of node or a hub for some of that expertise, and I'm excited about that.
So this project was announced in November of 2023, and we have been sort of getting things started. We just hired you, and so we now have your expertise in hydrology, irrigation, water management. Can you give us an update of what's next for the project?
So we're at a reasonably early stage in the project at the moment, and we're working on our RFAs, which are essentially requests to partners for proposals in one of 4 areas of research, and we expect to have those RFAs ready and draft by the end of this month, and get them out as soon as we can so that we can get some of this research going. We're working in countries mostly in sub-Saharan Africa, but we include Honduras and Guatemala in Central America, and Nepal in South Asia as well. So, and we're not completely limited to those, but those are going to be the focal countries and areas. And all of that information will be in the RFAs when they come out. We obviously are looking for solutions at the local scale that are implementable and that are measurable. And I think we're going to make that clear in our RFAs too. So, yeah, in summary, we're getting started. We've got some early projects that are already approved and that are going. They were approved as part of our first round of engagement, and they're running now, or 2 of them are at least, with the 3rd we expect to get up and running pretty soon. Those are going to be joined, hopefully before too long, by a selection of other projects working in our 4 areas.
Great. And just for anyone looking for information on those RFAs, you will be able to find those on our website at waterforfood.nebraska.edu/irrig and mech. That's waterforfood.nebraska.edu/IRRIGANDMECH. And we'll have it linked in our show notes as well. So I just want to thank you so much, Jude. We're so happy to have you here and really looking forward to working with you on this project.
Thanks so much, Ariana, and it's lovely to be here. Thank you, and looking forward to it too.
Thanks for joining us this time on the Daugherty Water for Food podcast. Make sure to visit our website, waterforfood.nebraska.edu, to view show notes or subscribe so you don't miss future episodes.